Imagine you're walking through the ancient, really labyrinthine streets of Cairo.
Oh yeah, the old city. It's incredibly dense.
Exactly. You're completely surrounded by these intense, just layered sights and sounds, the kind you'd expect in one of the most historic, fiercely alive cities in the Islamic world.
Right, it's a very specific energy, very loud, very vibrant.
Yeah, and picture the dust catching that late afternoon sun.
Mm.
It turns the air this like thick golden color, you know?
I know exactly what you mean. The golden hour in Cairo is legendary.
It really is. So the markets, the souks, they are absolutely bustling. You've got vendors calling out. There's that amazing smell of roasted meats and spices just hanging in the air.
And the crowd pressing in around you is, I mean, it's predominantly Egyptian, right?
Yeah.
Predominantly Sunni Muslim.
Right, exactly. It's a scene, like a specific rhythm of life that has played out in various ways on these exact same streets for literally centuries.
Which is fascinating in itself.
But then, as you navigate through this crush of people, you approach the breathtaking, just monumental stone walls of the Al-Hakim Mosque, and the whole landscape shifts.
Visually and auditorily, it's a massive change.
The huge change. Suddenly, right in the middle of this typical everyday Cairo crowd, you start to spot these large, incredibly distinct groups of people.
They stand out instantly, don't they?
Oh, completely. They are dressed entirely, like uniformly, in these striking, brilliant white robes.
Light from head to toe.
Yes. The men often have these distinct caps woven with gold thread, and the women are in equally pristine white garments with these intricate, colorful borders.
And if you get close enough to this moving sea of white, you realize something else. They aren't speaking the local Egyptian Arabic.
No, they aren't. You hear this totally unique melodic language. It's a fascinating mix of Arabic and a distinctly Indian dialect.
Right, which immediately tells you they're not local.
Not at all. And as they enter the soaring gates of this architectural marvel, this 1,000-year-old stone courtyard, they aren't just looking around like typical tourists.
They aren't checking off a guidebook box or snapping casual photos.
Exactly. They are weeping. I mean, they are falling to their knees, pressing their foreheads against the stone in this absolute, just overwhelming reverence.
Because to the people in these white robes, this isn't just a historical ruin. You know, it's not just a neat architectural site.
No, this is a deeply sacred, ancestral, spiritual home to them. They believe, with every fiber of their being, that they have finally returned.
It is an incredibly powerful, almost disorienting image when you first encounter it in person.
I can imagine. Why is it so disorienting, though?
Because it immediately tells you that you are looking at this wild intersection of history, geography, and theology that, frankly, the vast majority of people walk right past without ever noticing.
Right, they just blend into the background if you don't know what you're looking at.
Exactly. You are looking at a community that feels, in that specific moment, fundamentally out of time and out of place.
Huh.
And yet, they are standing exactly where they believe they were cosmologically ordained to be.
It's like witnessing a physical manifestation of a 1,000-year-old memory.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So the people we are talking about today in this deep dive are the Bohras.
The Bohras, yes. A deeply fascinating group.
They are a highly secretive, incredibly wealthy Ismaili Shia sect, and they boast a history that honestly reads like an epic, globe-spanning fantasy novel.
Except every wild twist and turn is entirely real.
Exactly. We're talking about a timeline that stands from the absolute golden age of the Fatimid Empire in Egypt, when they were literally the most powerful people on the planet.
To hiding in the rugged, just terrifyingly steep mountains of Yemen, under the rule of this visionary queen.
Right, and then finally migrating across the ocean to the trading ports of India.
Where they essentially build an impenetrable global community by completely reinventing their outward identity.
Their entire story is just defined by survival, isn't it? Survival, adaptation, and this unwavering, unbreakable commitment to a very specific, fiercely debated spiritual lineage.
It really is. They are a community that has managed to maintain an ancient, highly esoteric identity in a hyper-modern world.
And they did it largely by mastering the art of hiding in plain sight. They didn't survive by fighting every single battle.
No, they survived by becoming entirely indispensable to the economies of the empires that hosted them.
So our goal for this deep dive is to really unpack the mechanics of this survival. We are going to explore their highly complex origins and that initial world-altering theological split that set them on this path.
We'll have to look at exactly how they survived centuries of intense persecution by literally disguising themselves as wandering merchants, too.
Yes, the disguise aspect is wild. We'll delve into the inner workings of their esoteric rituals as well, like the mechanics behind maintaining a fixed mathematical 30-day Ramadan.
And how they justify condensing the 5 daily Islamic prayers into 3. That's a huge point of divergence.
Right. And finally, we're going to understand the psychology and the logistics behind why, today, they pour tens of millions of dollars into restoring Egyptian antiquities without asking for a single plaque or a shred of public credit.
We are essentially tracing a roadmap that touches on the rise and fall of massive empires, the dangerous nature of absolute spiritual authority and survival.
The incredible, sometimes completely ruthless lengths human beings will go to protect what they believe is the ultimate sacred truth.
So to you listening right now, whether you are a dedicated history buff trying to fill in the blank spots on the map,
Or whether you are fascinated by the intricate clockwork mechanics of world religions.
or even if you just love a genuinely sprawling story about secret societies, ancient bloodlines, and hidden knowledge, this deep dive is going to challenge what you think you know about the Islamic world.
Because to truly understand who the Bohras are today, and to understand the profound emotion of why they are weeping in a restored courtyard in Cairo, we cannot start in the present.
No, we have to go all the way back to the root of the family tree.
Right, we have to understand the core theological split that created Ismaili Shiism in the very first place.
You really cannot understand the Bohras without understanding the Ismailis. And you absolutely cannot understand the Ismailis without grasping the fundamental Shia belief regarding the concept of the Imam.
I think a lot of people outside the faith might hear the word imam and think of it the way a Sunni Muslim does, right? Like a knowledgeable scholar or a community leader.
Yeah, the person who leads the Friday prayer at the local mosque. But in the Shia worldview, and particularly in the Ismaili worldview, the Imam is something entirely different.
It's a much heavier concept.
Much heavier. The Imam is considered a living, breathing extension of the Prophet Muhammad, and indeed an extension of all the prophets stretching continuously all the way back to Adam.
So they possess this divine, infallible knowledge.
Exactly. The Imam is the sole individual on earth with the true, divinely appointed ability to interpret Sharia law, and more importantly, the inner hidden meanings of the universe.
The absolute cosmic weight placed on the person of the Imam, I mean, it just cannot be overstated.
If we try to step into their theological framework for a second, knowing the Imam of your specific time is not just a good idea. It is the essential, non-negotiable condition for your faith.
It's the prerequisite for the acceptance of any of your good deeds,
Yeah.
right?
If you give to charity, if you pray, if you fast, but you do not recognize the true Imam, those actions are considered spiritually void.
Which is terrifying if you get it wrong. The foundational texts of this belief system make this incredibly stark.
They really do. They maintain that whoever dies without knowing the Imam of their time dies a death of ignorance.
And in their cosmology, this means dying untethered from divine truth, essentially outside the protection of the faith entirely.
So the stakes could literally not be higher here. We aren't talking about a disagreement over tax policy or a minor border dispute.
Right. Your eternal soul, the entire purpose of your creation, depends on knowing and following the correct, divinely appointed Imam.
Which brings us to the crucial schism, the massive historical earthquake, where the timeline fractures for them.
We are looking at the 8th century here, specifically at the 6th Imam, a towering historical and intellectual figure named Jafar al-Sadiq.
Jafar al-Sadiq had an immense following, a massive intellectual legacy, and he had several sons. But the two most important figures for our story are his eldest son, Ismail, and a younger son, Musa al-Qadim.
And this is exactly where the tree branches into two entirely different forests, so to speak.
It really is the dividing line. The majority of Shia Muslims today, the ones we see primarily in modern nation-states like Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon, they're universally known as the Twelvers.
And they ended up following the younger son, Musa al-Qadim.
Exactly. They believe the legitimate divine line of imams continued through him, down to a 12th imam.
Who they believe went into this miraculous state of hiding or occultation and will return at the end of times as the Mahdi to bring ultimate justice.
Right, that's the Twelver narrative. But then you have this other incredibly devoted faction, the Seveners, or the Ismailis.
They looked at the exact same situation in the 8th century completely differently, didn't they?
They did. They believed that Jafar al-Sadiq had explicitly, formally designated his eldest son, Ismail, to be the next imam.
Now, here is the massive historical curveball that shatters the community.
Yeah.
Ismail died.
Yeah. He died before his father, Jafar al-Sadiq, passed away.
Which instantly creates an enormous Existential theological crisis.
Huge crisis. For the faction that becomes the Twelvers, the argument that developed later on is that Ismail's initial designation must have been a kind of protective ruse.
A ruse, like a decoy.
Essentially, yes. They lived under the intense, deeply paranoid rule of the Abbasid Caliphate, who frequently assassinated Shia leaders.
Ah, so the Twelvers argue that announcing Ismail as the heir was a way to draw the Abbasid crosshairs onto him.
Exactly, thereby hiding the true Imam, Musa al-Khatim, in the shadows to keep him safe.
But for the Ismailis, that logic is fundamentally flawed and totally unyielding, right?
Completely. They argue that an imam's designation is not a political maneuver. It is a divine text. It is a decree from God himself.
And God does not make mistakes. Nor does a divine decree simply get reversed or undone just because of the inconvenient timing of human mortality.
Right. A divine decree is eternal. So if the designation absolutely cannot be reversed and Ismail is dead, what on earth do they do?
Well, their solution is mathematically strict. They believe the Imam automatically, inevitably passed to Ismail's eldest son, Muhammad al-Maktoum.
He inherits the divine spark directly from his grandfather, effectively bypassing the dead father and becoming the seventh Imam, hence the name Seveners.
The line must continue through the designated branch, regardless of the physical death of the intermediate father. The divine authority moved directly to the grandson.
That is the core Ismaili position, yes.
If I'm trying to wrap my head around the pure chaos this must have caused on the ground, it's essentially a medieval royal succession crisis, but on a cosmic scale.
It really is.
Imagine a sprawling, powerful kingdom where the aging king explicitly names his eldest son, the crown prince, as his successor. But then, the crown prince suddenly dies in a hunting accident.
Right, a classic historical scenario.
Half the kingdom says, well, the crown prince is dead, so we must pivot and pledge our absolute loyalty to the king's surviving younger son. He's next in line.
But the other, fiercely loyal half of the kingdom says, no, the king's word is eternal law. The crown belongs to the deceased eldest son's lineage.
Exactly. The grandson is the true king, even if he's young or unproven. And this isn't just about who gets to sit on a velvet throne, mint the coins, and collect the grain taxes.
No, this disagreement creates two entirely different, deeply opposed spiritual empires.
The royal analogy works perfectly for the mechanics of it, but we always have to remember to multiply the psychological intensity by 1,000.
Because a mortal king only dictates the conditions of your physical life, your taxes, your safety, your laws.
Right, but the imam, in this framework, dictates your spiritual destiny. To follow the wrong claimant isn't just treason against a state, it is treason against the architecture of the universe.
But that immense psychological intensity is exactly where I struggle to understand the mindset of the everyday follower back then.
What do you mean?
Well, if knowing the true imam is so unbelievably vital, if picking the wrong brother means your eternal soul is damned and your prayers are totally useless, doesn't a disputed, incredibly messy succession crisis like this create just massive, paralyzing spiritual panic?
Oh, absolutely it does. If you're a farmer or a merchant in the 8th century, how do you know for sure you are following the right lineage when the historical signs are this convoluted?
Especially when it's being debated by the smartest scholars in the room.
You're touching on the exact vulnerability that shaped their entire philosophy moving forward. The potential for spiritual panic was very real.
But the Ismaili theology didn't collapse under that panic. It actually evolved.
Right. It developed a robust, highly complex internal logic to combat it. They began to lean heavily into the concept of esoteric knowledge.
Esoteric meaning hidden, inner knowledge.
Yes. They argued that the truth of the universe is deliberately not obvious. It is not neatly packaged on the surface for the uninitiated to easily grasp.
So the very fact that this succession was difficult, that it required a leap of profound faith to follow the lineage of the deceased Ismail down to his son against all political common sense, that was framed as a test.
Exactly. It was a test to separate the true, spiritually insightful believers from those who just followed the easiest, most politically convenient path. The difficulty validates the truth.
So the confusion is actually a filter. It's a feature, not a bug.
Oh, right. It requires this intense, unyielding dedication to see past the obvious physical setbacks. And this specific faction, these Ismailis who followed the grandson, Muhammad al-Maktoum, they didn't just stay a quiet, underground philosophical book club debating secession in the shadows.
No, they certainly did not.
They took this absolute ironclad belief in their imam, and they leveraged it to build one of the greatest, wealthiest, and most sophisticated empires in the entire history of the Islamic world.
That sheer, unbending theological conviction served as the ultimate engine for state building.
They transitioned from being a hunted, persecuted minority, communicating in secret codes and hiding in mountain fortresses, to occupying the absolute pinnacle of global geopolitical power.
Which means we need to look at how that theological seed bloomed into a superpower. Because building a physical empire in Egypt brings us to a massive contradiction.
We're moving into the era of the Fatimid Caliphate now, right?
Yes, where Ismaili theology collided head-on with the brutal, pragmatic realities of running a massive medieval state.
The rise of the Fatimid state is one of the most remarkable logistical and military achievements of the era, and it didn't even start in Egypt.
No, it was initially founded in North Africa, in what is now Tunisia, by an Ismaili leader known as al-Mahdi.
He emerged from hiding and declared himself the visible imam and caliph. He built a powerful state, challenging the Abbasids directly.
But North Africa wasn't enough for them. They had their eyes on the prize of the Mediterranean.
So in the Islamic year 362, which is roughly 973 CE, under the leadership of a brilliant caliph named Al-Mu'izz, the Fatimid armies marched east.
They conquered Egypt and moved the absolute center of their caliphate there.
And they didn't just move into an existing capital like Alexandria or Fustat. They wanted a blank canvas to project their divine authority.
So they built an entirely new, heavily fortified palatial city. They called it Al-Qahira.
Which we know today as Cairo. They literally built Cairo from the ground up.
It's staggering to think about the sheer hubris and capability required to do that in the 10th century.
And within this new glittering capital, they built the great iconic mosques of Cairo to serve as centers of both prayer and massive intellectual propaganda.
What is genuinely fascinating is the specific naming convention they used for these structures. The architects and theologians of the Fatimid state named these grand monuments on the linguistic pattern of al-Afdal,
which roughly translates from Arabic to the best, the most radiant, or the most favored.
Right. So you have al-Astar, meaning the most radiant, which they founded as a massive center of learning.
And which remains one of the most famous and influential mosques and universities in the world today.
You also have Al-Anwar, the most luminous, which is the official original name of the Al-Hakim Mosque we described in the intro.
You have Al-Aqmar, the moonlit, and Al-Afkar, the most glorious. They were literally stamping their absolute belief in their own supremacy onto the physical skyline of Egypt in stone and gold.
They reached this incredible peak of civilization. They have the wealth of the Nile, they control the Red Sea trade routes, they have this magnificent capital.
And eventually, the timeline brings us to the reign of a caliph named Al-Mustansir. Now, Al-Mustansir is a titan when you look at Egyptian Islamic history.
He really is. He took the throne as a child and ruled for a staggering 60 years.
60 years. That is the longest ruling leader in the entire recorded history of Islamic Egypt.
But a 60-year reign is a very long time to hold on to absolute power. And the longer you rule, the more time there is for the fragile systems of a medieval state to break down.
And in the later years of his incredibly long rule, the Fatimid state experienced a catastrophic system-breaking crisis that almost wiped them off the map.
Historians refer to this devastating period as the Mustansiriya famine, and we have to be clear about the scale of this.
This wasn't just a bad harvest or a slight economic downturn, was?
No, this was a total apocalyptic collapse of the central authority brought on by a prolonged failure of the Nile to flood.
The Nile was the absolute lifeblood of Egypt. If it didn't flood, you didn't have crops.
And it failed for 7 consecutive years. 7 years. The accounts from this period are horrific.
There were severe, unimaginable food shortages.
Yeah.
Mass starvation led to recorded instances of cannibalism in the streets of Cairo.
The wealth of the state just evaporated. The caliph had to sell off the royal treasures just to buy bread.
And predictably, under this immense stress, the military fractured into warring ethnic factions. You had the Berber regiments fighting the Turkish regiments, fighting the Sudanese regiments.
The state was quite literally tearing itself apart from the inside, and the divine imam, al-Mustansir, was powerless to stop it. He was effectively a prisoner in his own palace.
And history shows us time and time again, whenever there is a massive bleeding power vacuum like that, someone utterly ruthless always steps in to fill it.
Enter a man named Badr al-Jamali.
He was an Armenian military commander, a former slave who had risen to become the governor of Acre in the Levant. He was highly effective, utterly uncompromising, and commanded an intensely loyal personal army.
The desperate Caliph al-Mustansir secretly calls for his help. Badr al-Jamali essentially marches his army into Cairo, brutally purges the warring military factions.
Often by inviting their leaders to a banquet and having them slaughtered.
Yes, a very classic, brutal move. And he crushes the chaos. He saves the Fatimid state from total destruction.
But as they say, nothing in politics comes for free. In exchange for pulling the empire back from the brink, Badr al-Jamali monopolizes almost all the functional power of the state.
The Caliph al-Mustansir is still sitting on a throne. He's still technically the divine imam. But Badr al-Jamali takes all the titles that actually matter.
He becomes the commander of the armies, he becomes the chief of the judges, and most astonishingly, he demands and takes the title of chief of the preachers.
That last title, chief of the preachers, is the crucial paradigm-shifting detail.
Why is that one so important?
Taking command of the military and the judiciary is standard practice for a military dictator. But the chief of the preachers means he is not just controlling the swords and the courts. He is controlling the religious hierarchy, the dawah itself.
Wow, so he has placed himself at the very top of the Ismaili missionary network.
He centralized all worldly administrative power and all religious bureaucratic power into his own hands. And to permanently solidify this new reality, he even married his daughter to one of the younger sons of the Caliph al-Mustansir.
Wait, so this is essentially a medieval Hand of the King scenario, but on steroids.
Very much so.
Badr al-Jamali rides in, saves the realm from complete disaster, but in doing so, he effectively strips the caliph of all his functional power, leaving him as a divine figurehead trapped in a gilded cage.
But this is exactly where I hit a massive wall with the theology. How do you reconcile a divinely guided, all-knowing leader being entirely sidelined and manipulated by a military general?
We just established that the imam possesses cosmic knowledge and absolute authority. Doesn't watching your infallible divine leader hand over the keys to the religion to a warlord completely shatter the illusion of divine authority for the everyday believer?
It is a profound, glaring contradiction. And looking at how the community rationalized it reveals so much about how religious ideology bends to survive political reality.
How did they rationalize it?
For the everyday believer, the justification heavily relies on the concept of the batan, the hidden inner meaning.
Right, the esoteric layer.
The theologians would argue that the imam's withdrawal from daily, messy administrative duties is a divine test for the believers, or perhaps a deliberate cosmic strategy that mere mortals simply cannot understand.
They would argue that his inherent spiritual authority, his divine essence, remains totally untouched and pure, regardless of who signs the tax decrees or commands the archers.
Exactly. But you are entirely correct that politically and practically, it set a highly dangerous precedent. It visibly demonstrated that military might could dictate terms to the divine imam.
And that dangerous precedent absolutely explodes the very moment the old Caliph al-Mustansir finally dies.
Because Badr al-Jamali had already passed away, but his son al-Afdal seamlessly inherited his father's immense dictatorial military power.
So when the 60-year reign of al-Mustansir ends, a colossal, empire-breaking succession war erupts between his sons.
You have the elder son, Nizar, who is an adult, who has the support of many of the religious purists, and who expects to be the next imam.
And then you have a much younger son, al-Mustali.
And the most important fact about al-Mustali is that he is the brother-in-law to al-Afdal, the military dictator.
Ah, of course. So al-Afdal, acting purely in his own political self-interest to maintain control over the throne, uses his absolute military power to aggressively bypass the elder son Nizar and forcefully install the younger son, al-Mustali, as the new caliph and imam.
Which permanently, irreparably shatters the Ismaili world. This is the Great Schism.
So Nizar refuses to accept this, I assume.
Yes. Nizar flees to Alexandria, attempts a massive rebellion, but he is ultimately outmaneuvered, crushed, and executed by the military regime.
However, a significant, highly militant portion of the global Ismaili community, particularly those operating far outside the reach of the Egyptian military in places like Persia, led by the legendary and terrifying figure Hassani Saba, they absolutely refused to believe Nizar was dead.
Or at the very least, they entirely refused to recognize the religious legitimacy of the military's puppet, al-Mustali. They broke off entirely.
They became the Nizaris, they retreated to mountain fortresses like Alamut, they utilized targeted assassination as a political tool, becoming famous in Western Crusader lore as the Assassins.
And their specific lineage continues to this very day evolving incredibly over the centuries into a modern global community currently under the leadership of the Aga Khan.
But the faction that stayed in Egypt, the ones who accepted al-Mustali, whether they genuinely believed his designation was valid or whether they just exercised sheer political pragmatism to survive under the military dictatorship, they became the Mustalis.
And it is this specific surviving branch, the Mustalis, who are the direct, unbroken ancestors of the Bohras we are tracking today.
This split is vital to internalize. It wasn't just a political disagreement over who got to sleep in the palace. It permanently bifurcated the Ismaili spiritual universe.
The Nizaris went one way, embracing a radical militancy that eventually, over many centuries, evolved into a very modern, highly visible, outward-looking community.
Right, like the Aga Khans eventually abolished the standard physical Islamic prayers for their followers in favor of highly individualized, esoteric supplications.
The Mustalis, on the other hand, went a completely different route, one that would plunge them into deep secrecy, extreme ritual adherence, and eventual permanent exile.
And that exile, that dramatic journey into the shadows, begins because the Mustali line didn't get to enjoy their political victory in Egypt for very long, did they?
Not at all. The political ground in Cairo was actively crumbling beneath their feet, which brings us to a desperately young imam, a brilliant queen in Yemen, and a theological concept that changes everything.
The turmoil inside Fatimid Egypt only accelerated. Al-Mustali dies, and his son, Al-Amr by Akmala, takes the throne as caliph.
But the political situation is toxic, the military dictates everything, and in the year 524 AH, which is roughly 1130 CE, Caliph Al-Amr is violently assassinated by Nizari agents.
And his sudden, bloody death creates a succession crisis even more bizarre and chaotic than the one that triggered the Great Schism.
Because, according to historical records of the time, Al-Amr left behind an infant son, a baby boy, barely a year old, named Al-Tayyib.
Now, it doesn't matter how divine your bloodline is, you physically cannot have a one-year-old running an empire that is actively collapsing from internal strife and external crusader threats.
So, the infant's older cousin, a man named Abdul Majid, immediately seizes power in Cairo. Initially, he plays the political game.
He claims she is merely a guardian, a regent holding the throne safe and warm until the infant Al-Tayyib comes of age.
But very, very quickly, the mask drops. He imprisons his rivals, he assumes the royal title of Al-Hafiz, and eventually he outright declares himself the official caliph and the legitimate imam.
And this blatant usurpation is where the geographic center of our story shifts dramatically. Because while the terrified, military-dominated court in Cairo might have reluctantly accepted this usurpation by Al-Hafiz just to maintain order, the Ismaili religious mission operating thousands of miles away in Yemen absolutely, categorically refused.
We really need to look at what was happening in Yemen. The Ismaili mission there wasn't just a small group of preachers. They were operating under the direct protection and patronage of a powerful local ruling family called the Salahid dynasty.
And when they received the official letters from Cairo declaring Abdul-Majid is the new imam now, adjust your prayers accordingly, the leadership in Yemen rejected it completely.
They declared their absolute, unwavering loyalty to the infant, Al-Tayyib. They argued Al-Amr was the true imam, and therefore his son Al-Tayyib is the only true imam, and we will not follow a cousin who stole the throne.
And by taking this rigid stance, they officially severed ties with the Fatimid state in Egypt. They became their own entity, known from then on as the Tayyibi movement.
This is a monumental, highly dangerous pivot. The center of gravity, the pure spiritual core for this specific branch of Ismailism, has now violently separated from the immense wealth and palaces of Cairo and relocated to the isolated, rugged, highly tribal mountains of Yemen.
And what makes this transition so incredibly compelling and so historically unique is the specific person who engineered it, provided the political cover for it, and held the entire fractured community together.
Queen Arwa, also known as Sayyida al-Hura, the Free Lady. If there is one historical figure in this timeline who deserves a movie, it is her.
She is genuinely unparalleled in the geopolitics of this era. Queen Arwa was married into the ruling Salahid family of Yemen, but her husband suffered from severe physical ailments, eventually incapacitated by a stroke.
So instead of letting the state collapse or fall to ambitious warlords, she stepped up. She moved the capital to the highly defensible city of Jibla, and she effectively ruled Yemen for 50 years.
She wasn't just a political placeholder or a figurehead taking orders from viziers either. She was a brilliant, strategic, ruthless when necessary, and deeply respected sovereign leader.
But her political acumen isn't even the most astounding part. Her religious authority within the faith was unprecedented.
Decades before the assassination chaos, the Fatimid Caliph in Egypt, recognizing her incredible intellect and capability, had actually formally granted her the title of Hujja, which translates to the proof.
We really must emphasize how extraordinary this is in the context of the time and the theology. The Ismaili missionary structure, the Dawa, is a strictly hierarchical, rigidly ordered male system.
It functions like an esoteric corporate ladder for salvation, moving from lower, localized ranks up to the absolute leadership.
Queen Arwa is the only woman in the entire recorded history of medieval Islam to reach such a high, commanding religious rank within this strict male hierarchy.
When the schism happened, when Cairo fell to a usurper, she was the anchor. She was the highest-ranking religious authority for the Tayyibi movement.
She provided both the physical armies to protect them and the theological umbrella for them to survive, breaking away from the mothership in Egypt.
It really is incredible. You have this highly patriarchal, tribal medieval society, and yet a woman essentially holds this entire fractured, panicking spiritual movement together through sheer force of will and intellect. She ensures their survival.
But the theological reality of what they actually claimed happened to that infant Imam al-Tayyib is where things get deeply mysterious and set the stage for how the religion functions today.
Because they couldn't produce the infant. So under Queen Arwa's careful watch, the Tayyibi movement officially declared a new theological reality.
The infant Imam al-Tayyib had gone into what they call occultation. The Arabic terms used in their theology are sit or taqiyya, meaning concealment or protective hiding.
Meaning he was hidden from the world. Now, practically speaking, secular historians furiously debate what actually happened to the child in Cairo.
Some historical accounts suggest the usurper cousin, Abdul Majid, simply had the baby quietly murdered to eliminate the threat.
Other accounts within the Tayyibi faith fervently believe the child was safely spirited away by loyalists, smuggled out of Egypt, and hidden.
But spiritually, the belief is absolute and foundational. Al-Tayyib went into hiding, and his divine lineage continues, passing from father to son in total secrecy, generation after generation, to this very day.
The Imam exists on earth, he breathes, he possesses the divine light, but the world is entirely denied the privilege of seeing him.
And this is where the mechanics of running a religion hit a serious roadblock.
Right. What does occultation actually mean for the day-to-day operation of a massively complex religious community?
How does a deeply hierarchical, highly organized faith function for centuries when its absolute God-appointed leader completely disappears from the public eye?
If the guy who has the sole authority to interpret the law is gone, doesn't the whole system just freeze or grind to a halt?
It's the most logical question to ask, and the answer reveals the sheer pragmatic genius of Ismaili theological mechanics. They didn't freeze. They activated a protocol.
They have a built-in, highly sophisticated rule regarding secrecy and manifestation, don't they?
Yes, the doctrine explicitly states, when the imam is public, visible, and ruling a state like they were in Egypt, the preachers, the missionaries of the Dawah, must operate in secret to protect the spread of the faith from political enemies.
But when the imam goes into hiding, into occultation, the dynamic flips.
Exactly. The preachers become public. The Dawah itself steps out of the shadows and into the light to openly manage, guide, and protect the community on behalf of the hidden imam.
That is a brilliant, flexible mechanism. It's like a theological failsafe built directly into the source code of the religion.
It allowed the movement to survive indefinitely, without a visible leader to act as a target. The imam is hidden, so the highest-ranking visible missionary simply takes the reins of daily operations.
It completely removes the immediate physical vulnerability of having a localized target on the imam's back, while perfectly preserving the intricate spiritual structure.
The community is sustained internally by the absolute belief in the hidden imam, while being practically physically governed by the visible, highly trained missionaries. The engine keeps running, it just shifts who is driving.
And they needed that engine running perfectly because even with this brilliant theological failsafe in place, the physical geopolitical reality of staying in the mountains of Yemen was rapidly becoming a death sentence.
Which explains their next massive transformation. The geopolitical vice around Yemen was tightening relentlessly.
After Queen Arwa passed away, the Tayyibi lost their massive political shield, right?
Yes. They now faced intense existential pressure from a rival Shia sect, the Zaydis.
Now, the Zaydis were militarily powerful, they were deeply embedded in the highland tribes, and they had established a robust, long-lasting state in Yemen.
And they viewed the Ismailis not just as theological rivals with bad ideas, but as a severe, highly contagious political threat that needed to be eradicated.
Because the Ismaili mission wasn't just preaching quiet reflection. They had a very specific, dangerous, revolutionary appeal to the masses. They promised an earthly paradise.
They preached that following the true, just Imam would literally bring about salvation, perfect equity, and divine justice on earth, right now, in this life, not just in some abstract afterlife.
And if we look at the reality of a medieval society filled with extreme poverty, rigid inequality, heavy taxation, and often harsh, indifferent rulers, a highly organized movement promising immediate earthly salvation and justice is a massive destabilizing threat to the status quo.
The Zaydis completely understood this populist appeal and consistently launched brutal military campaigns to suppress, marginalize, and destroy the Tayyibi communities.
And if the constant warfare with the Zaydis wasn't enough, later on in history, the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire also entered Yemen, adding yet another heavy layer of imperial persecution and taxation.
The pressure was unsustainable. They had to run. They needed a new home far away from the Zaydis and the Ottomans where they could survive and rebuild.
And they looked east, utilizing the ancient maritime trade routes across the Arabian Sea to the western coast of India, specifically the wealthy cosmopolitan region of Gujarat.
But you can't exactly move an entire radical revolutionary religious movement across the ocean and set up shop without drawing immediate, violently hostile attention from the powerful local Indian rulers.
Right, they couldn't arrive as zealots, they had to arrive as something useful.
Survival necessitated a total radical transformation in their outward identity. The Ismaili missionaries traveled across the sea to India, actively disguising themselves.
They presented themselves as wandering, peaceful Sufi mystics, as quiet, apolitical pilgrims, and most importantly, most successfully, they presented themselves as merchants.
They integrated themselves seamlessly into the massive, highly lucrative trade networks of the Indian Ocean. They dealt in textiles, spices, and precious metals.
They made themselves economically valuable to the local rulers while keeping their esoteric theology completely hidden behind closed doors.
And this brilliant disguise eventually became their permanent, defining identity. In the local Gujarati language of the region, the word for merchant or trader is Bohra.
Now, historians do debate the exact etymology, right? Some suggest it might have originally meant outcasts or untouchables in older dialects.
Yes, but the dominant, universally accepted, meaning that the community embraced, is merchant. They dropped the revolutionary rhetoric in public. They became known simply by their incredibly successful profession. They became the Bohras.
The strategy worked flawlessly. By the year 1567, the persecution in Yemen was so suffocating that the official headquarters of the movement, the physical seat of the absolute missionary, officially and permanently relocated from the mountains of Yemen to the bustling ports of India.
Now, we should quickly note that centuries later, there was another administrative split. Roughly speaking, the community divided between those who stayed deeply rooted in India, became known as the Dawoodi Bohra, and a smaller faction that remained tied to the historical centers in Yemen, known as the Sulaimani Bohra.
The Sulaimani faced massive ongoing restrictions and persecution from the rising Saudi state and the continuing Zaydi presence, and over time their numbers severely dwindled.
But the Dawoodi Bohra, the ones who fully embraced the Indian merchant identity, they absolutely flourished.
They thrived beyond measure. They found a way to navigate and exist highly successfully under the powerful, often unpredictable Muslim Mughal emperors, utilizing their immense wealth to buy favor and protection.
And later, when the geopolitical map shifted again, they found an even more stable, highly profitable footing under British colonial rule.
And they achieved this immense success through a policy of absolute, rigid political neutrality. They stayed completely out of the local rebellions. They didn't agitate for independence early on.
They focused entirely on commerce, on expanding their trade networks from East Africa to Southeast Asia, on building their communal wealth. And they maintained a strict, highly publicized loyalty to whatever sovereign state they happened to live in, paying their taxes and obeying the secular laws.
But stepping back, the glaring irony here is almost whiplash-inducing. They start out in the palaces of Egypt and the mountains of Yemen as this highly radical, revolutionary religious movement that promises to overthrow the unjust world and establish a divine earthly paradise.
Right, and a few centuries later, they end up as a quiet, politically neutral, incredibly wealthy, conservative merchant class thriving under the bureaucracy of the British Empire.
How does that happen? Did they just abandon their revolutionary roots entirely because they got rich? Did they sell out their theology for survival?
It's very easy to look that trajectory with a modern, cynical lens and conclude they sold out. But historically and internally, the analysis is entirely
They
different.
didn't abandon their core esoteric beliefs, did they?
No, they built an impenetrable economic fortress around them. By dominating regional trade, they generated immense, unparalleled wealth. And they didn't just hoard that wealth individually. They used it to establish incredibly powerful internal institutions.
For example, in the early 19th century, they founded the Al-Jami'atu Sayfiyya, a major, highly rigorous, immensely funded theological university complex.
They realized that if they couldn't conquer the world militarily or politically like the Fatimids did, they could build an impenetrable, perfectly ordered, self-sustaining world of their own, entirely within it.
Their massive commercial success was the physical shield that protected the fragile flame of their esoteric theology,
The wealth is the armor. It buys you the privilege of being left alone to practice in secret.
which perfectly explains how they operate today. Because with the divine imam hidden for centuries, and the community deeply settled into this highly successful, wealthy merchant lifestyle in India and around the globe, who is actually running the show?
How do you maintain such tight, cohesive, unbreakable control over a global, highly educated community that today numbers between 1 to 2 million people?
The answer lies in the specific title we touched on earlier, the fail-safe mechanism, the al-Mutlaq, which translates to the absolute missionary.
According to Ismaili theory, in the physical absence of the occulted imam, this single chosen figure legally inherits all the administrative, practical, and social powers of the imam, the Bab, which means the gate to the imam and the chief missionary.
He is the absolute, unquestioned apex of the visible hierarchy, the absolute missionary. It's a title that leaves zero room for debate.
And currently, the leader, often respectfully referred to as the Sultan of the Bohra, is Mufaddal Burhanuddin. He is based in Mumbai, India.
And this position of absolute power is not elected by a council, is it? It is handed down by text, by direct, secretive designation from the predecessor, very much mirroring how the imams of old passed down their authority.
In recent centuries, this designation has frequently, though not always, stayed within the same ruling family, passing from father to son, creating a highly stable dynastic leadership.
And it is crucial to understand that the power of the al-Mutlaq is not just spiritual guidance. It is deeply, immensely financial.
He has ultimate control over the comes. In broader Shia tradition, this is a mandatory religious tax, a literal 1/5 levy on certain types of income or surplus wealth.
1/5, 20%. If you pause and do the math on that, if you have a highly insular community of 1 to 2 million highly successful merchants, doctors, engineers, and professionals globally, all paying 20%, that generates a mind-boggling, almost sovereign-level amount of wealth flowing to one central point.
How is that even managed without a nation-state apparatus?
It is managed through a highly efficient, deeply localized, bureaucratic network of deputies who collect and audit these funds in every city where Bohras live.
And this immense river of wealth is funneled directly to the absolute leader. He has complete, unquestioned discretion over its allocation.
However, the internal records and community realities show that this money is heavily utilized for massive, systemic community welfare projects.
They build state-of-the-art schools. They construct and fully fund hospitals that serve both their community and outsiders.
They quietly pay off the debts of needy families. They even arrange and fully fund marriages for widows or lower-income individuals within the community.
It's an all-encompassing, cradle-to-grave social safety net. You're perfectly taken care of.
But that safety net is managed through a strict, almost monastic-like social hierarchy. There is a rigid ladder you climb, starting at the base level as a responder, a regular believer, then moving up through various ranks of scholars and deputies to missionary, and theoretically up to the Gate of Gates.
Though that specific, incredibly high rank is currently vacant, because theology dictates that only a visible imam can officially appoint one.
But sitting above all the visible ranks, directing this massive social and financial machine, is the absolute missionary.
And the absolute glue, the psychological mechanism that holds this entire hierarchy, this wealth, and this community together across the globe, is the Ismaili oath, known as the Mithaq.
This is not a casual confirmation of faith. It is a paramount, highly severe ritual. When a Bohra reaches the age of maturity, usually around puberty, they are required to take a binding oath of allegiance and secrecy before the absolute missionary or his officially designated deputies.
They swear binding their soul to never reveal the esoteric, hidden secrets of the faith to outsiders, and to offer absolute obedience to the Dai.
And the penalty for breaking this oath, for rebelling against the Dai or revealing the secrets, is utterly terrifying within the context of their specific world.
The punishment is bara, which is spiritual excommunication.
But because the Bohras are so deliberately insular, because they exclusively marry within the sect, and because their entire social, familial, and economic lives are entirely entwined with the community's networks, spiritual excommunication is not just getting kicked out of a church.
No, it means total, devastating social exile. If you are excommunicated, your family is forbidden from speaking to you, your business partners will cut ties, your social network vanishes overnight. You lose absolutely everything.
So putting all these massive pieces together, you have a singular leader who inherits absolute, unquestioned power, who controls billions in untaxed wealth, who mandates a severe oath of secrecy, backed by the very real threat of total social and economic destruction.
To an outsider, honestly, this sounds like a highly efficient, massively powerful spiritual corporation where the CEO has absolute authority over your soul, your wallet, and your social life.
If a leader has this kind of unchecked absolute power, how do they justify this to the everyday believer? We're talking about modern, highly educated people living in London, New York, and Mumbai. How does a modern Bohra intellectually and emotionally accept this rigid structure?
It's a vital question. If we look at this impartially, entirely through the internal logic of the faith, the believer does not see a corporation, and they certainly do not see a CEO.
They see a sacred, divine trust. To the faithful Bohra, the al-Mutlaq is not taking this immense wealth for his own personal aggrandizement.
He is the faithful burden steward acting entirely on behalf of the hidden imam.
The profound, undeniable physical reality of that social safety net. The fact that if you fall ill, the community hospital treats you. If your business fails, the community network lifts you up. The absolute security of knowing you belong to a group that will catch you if you fall reinforces the spiritual trust constantly.
The system works for them in a highly tangible way. It provides absolute identity, absolute security, and a profound spiritual purpose in an otherwise chaotic, lonely modern world. That mutual obligation makes the community incredibly resilient.
It's an exchange of ultimate obedience for ultimate security. And that brings us to the actual physical practice of this highly ordered life. We've talked about the epic history and this rigid structural hierarchy, but what does it actually look like to practice this faith on a daily basis?
How does this deep, esoteric theology manifest when a Bohra wakes up on a Tuesday morning?
It all revolves around the fundamental dual concept of Zahir and Batin. Zahir is the outer, apparent, exoteric meaning of religious law and physical practice. It's the shell, it's what you can see everyone doing.
Batin is the inner, hidden, esoteric truth. It's the pearl inside the shell. And in their Ismaili belief system, only the imam, or by direct extension his absolute deputy, possesses the knowledge to interpret and explain the batin.
Let's ground this with a concrete example. Take the Hajj, the mandatory pilgrimage to Mecca. A Sunni or Twelver Shia Muslim travels to Mecca, circumambulates the Kaaba, stands on Mount Arafat, and fulfills the physical, outward requirement, the Zahir.
The Bohras also perform the physical Hajj. They go to Mecca. But for them, the batin, the true, hidden, esoteric meaning of the Hajj, is not just walking around a physical stone building in the desert.
The true Hajj, the ultimate spiritual goal, is the act of knowing the Imam and orienting your internal soul entirely towards him. The physical act of walking in Mecca is merely a necessary vessel for the much deeper esoteric truth of recognizing divine authority.
What's truly fascinating from a sociological perspective is how this reliance on ancient, hidden, mathematically precise knowledge alters their daily, visible practice in ways that sharply separate them from the rest of the Islamic world.
For instance, consider how they calculate time. The vast majority of the Islamic world relies on the physical, visual sighting of the new crescent moon to determine the start of months, particularly the holy month of Ramadan.
Right, which is why there's always that chaotic debate every single year about exactly which day Ramadan starts, with different countries starting on different days depending on whether it's cloudy in Saudi Arabia or somewhere else.
Exactly. It's tied to human observation. But the Bohras entirely reject this reliance on physical moon sightings. They use an ancient, highly sophisticated Fatimid astronomical system developed centuries ago in Cairo.
In the rigid calendar, the months strictly mathematically alternate. One month is exactly 30 days, the next is exactly 29 days in a continuous, unbroken cycle.
Because of this absolute mathematical certainty for the Bohras, the month of Ramadan is always, without exception, exactly 30 days long. They know precisely when it starts and when it ends, years in advance.
It's fixed. It's an astronomical certainty inherited directly from 11th century Cairo. And their daily prayers are uniquely adapted as well, which is a massive deviation.
Most Muslims pray 5 times a day at very specific, spaced-out intervals. The Bohras have historically condensed these 5 daily prayers into 3 focused sessions.
They pray Fajr at dawn, they combine prayers for Dhuhr at midday, and they combine again for Maghrib at sunset.
They intentionally skip the separate afternoon Oz and late-night Isha timings as independent sessions to significantly lessen the daily logistical burden on the believer, particularly for a community of working merchants.
Furthermore, they do not hold standard Friday congregational prayers with a traditional public sermon. This is a massive theological statement.
In classical Islamic jurisprudence, the Friday sermon, the khutbah, is deeply tied to the political and spiritual authority of the visible ruler. The preacher traditionally invokes the name of the ruler.
For the Bohras, because the true ultimate ruler, the Imam, is in occultation and hidden, the traditional Friday prayer simply cannot be legitimately held.
The lack of the sermon is a physical, weekly manifestation of his absence. They are actively mourning the fact that he isn't there to lead it.
And when they do pray in public spaces, in cities where they don't have their own exclusive complexes, they maintain a rigid separation.
If you go to the massive Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo today, you will not see the Bohras lining up shoulder to shoulder with the local Sunni congregation. They pray entirely separately.
They often gather in a very specific Fatimid-era section of the mosque known as the Mihrab of Fatima. They are physically standing in the exact same building as everyone else, but they are existing in a totally different spiritual and historical dimension.
We also see this stark distinction in their everyday language and dress. Their sacred religious texts are fiercely preserved in classical Arabic, honoring their Fatimid heritage in Egypt, but their everyday communal language spoken at home and in business is Gujarati, heavily peppered with specific Arabic and Persian vocabulary.
And visually, as you vividly noted in the very beginning, they exclusively wear white for religious gatherings.
The pristine white robes. Now, white is universally a symbol of purity across many cultures, but the history gives us a much more combative geopolitical reason for this specific choice.
Back in the Fatimid days, their mortal enemies, the rival Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, used black as their official dynastic color. The Abbasid armies marched under black banners.
So the Fatimids chose white specifically to politically oppose the Abbasid black. It was a medieval political uniform, a way of signaling we are not them, that has slowly evolved over 1,000 years into a sacred, permanent religious dress code.
Okay, looking at all of this together, the fixed mathematical 30-day Ramadan, the condensing of prayers to 3 sessions instead of 5, the refusal to hold Friday sermons, the distinct, highly specific language and dress code, it's as if they preserved the outer architecture of the religion, the walls, the roof, but completely redesigned the interior to serve an entirely different, highly esoteric spiritual purpose.
But here is the friction point. Since they have altered things that are so incredibly fundamental to the daily rhythm of Orthodox Islam, how are they viewed by the broader Sunni and Twelver Shia communities?
Doesn't this massive visible deviation invite constant conflict and accusations of heresy?
This raises one of the most fascinating paradoxes of the modern Bohra community. Theologically, internally, as we established with the concept of the Amma, they view anyone who does not believe in their specific Ismaili Imam as living in a state of ignorance.
Their internal doctrine of supremacy is absolute. Yet practically, socially, and politically, the Bohras are fiercely, intentionally non-confrontational.
They are the quietest people in the room. They absolutely do not proselytize. They aren't standing on street corners handing out pamphlets trying to convert their Sunni neighbors.
Exactly. Unlike their ancestors who fought brutal, bloody wars with the Zaydis in the mountains of Yemen, the modern Bohras simply do not fight with other sects.
Even when they fundamentally deeply disagree, such as their absolute refusal to recognize the imamate of the Aga Khan, who leads the Nizari Ismailis, the Bohra leadership maintains perfectly polite, diplomatic, quiet relations.
They practice their faith entirely behind closed doors. They insulate themselves socially through their massive community networks, and they focus entirely on commerce and internal welfare.
This absolute strategic refusal to engage in theological debate, conflict, or political agitation has allowed them to coexist peacefully and highly profitably in India, Pakistan, the West, and across the Middle East.
They essentially survived by realizing that you absolutely do not need to win the theological argument if you just refuse to show up for the argument in the first place.
Which brings us beautifully full circle to the final piece of this puzzle. We are returning to where we started. How did a community that has spent centuries hiding, evolving, and surviving as merchants in India manage to reconnect with the physical stone ruins of their ancient lost empire in Egypt?
To understand the sheer emotion of this return, we have to understand the sacred geography of their faith. For the Bohras, Cairo is not just a historical curiosity or a great place for a vacation, it is a holy city.
It is a place of active, essential, deeply emotional pilgrimage, arguably more central to their current ritual life than almost anywhere else in the world.
Because Cairo is the absolute last place on earth where their true, visible imams actually lived, ruled, built monuments, and walked the streets. It is the very last physical anchor to reality before the long, dark centuries of the occultation began.
Precisely. It is their Jerusalem, and for centuries they were entirely cut off from it, unable to safely travel or practice there.
But starting in the late 1970s, under the administration of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, and continuing very strongly today under the current Egyptian government, the political climate shifted to be more welcoming of investment.
The Bohra leadership saw a historic opportunity. They approached the Egyptian government with a highly specific, massively funded proposal. They wanted permission to restore the ruined, crumbling Fatimid monuments of Cairo.
And when we say ruined, we mean absolutely heartbreakingly ruined. Let's look closely at the Al-Hakim Mosque again. The history of this building is tragic.
Because the Fatimid endowments had dried up almost a millennium ago, the mosque had literally collapsed into total decay. Over the centuries, parts of this massive sacred structure were being used as a garlic warehouse.
It was used as a noisy primary school for local boys. The vast courtyards were so desolate, so thoroughly destroyed, they were actively used as the backdrop for mid-century Egyptian movies whenever a director needed to depict bleak, forgotten ruins. It was a hollow, decaying shell of its former glory.
The Bohras poured tens of millions of dollars into its restoration. And they didn't just patch the crumbling walls or fix the roof, they engaged in a massive, gleaming white, total reconstruction, bringing it back to what their scholars believed was its absolute pristine Fatimid state.
And they didn't stop with Al-Hakim. They painstakingly restored the Al-Qahira Mosque, meticulously rebuilding its incredibly intricate stone facade.
They funded massive, opulent restorations at the deeply revered shrines of Sayyida Zainab and Al-Hussein, places that are heavily frequented by all Egyptians, but are spiritually vital to the Bohras as physical remnants of the Prophet's family, the Al-Bayt.
They even managed to take over the highly mysterious Al-Jushi Shrine, which sits perched high up on the Muqaddam Hills, overlooking the entire sprawling city of Cairo. They fully restored it, and interestingly, they keep it locked.
It's not a tourist site. It is a pristine sanctuary exclusively for their community. And the absolute culmination of all this massive effort and wealth is seen during the month of Ramadan.
Massive crowds of Bohras fly in from Mumbai, from Karachi, from London, and from New York. They descend on the Al-Hakim Mosque.
They stay up all night, from the evening Isha prayers all the way until the dawn Fajr prayer, sitting on the marble floors, performing their deeply esoteric supplications in the exact physical space between the exact pillars that their ancient imams built 1,000 years ago.
And here is the most crucial, telling detail of this entire endeavor. They fund these multi-million-dollar, decade-long restorations without asking for a single shred of public credit.
They do not put up giant brass plaques with the Sina's name on it. They don't use this massive financial investment as leverage to gain seats in the Egyptian parliament or political power.
They aren't looking for a PR victory. For the Bohras, this restoration is purely 100% an act of absolute spiritual devotion. It is an act of physically saving the remnants of their divine history from turning to dust.
It's essentially like reclaiming your ancestral legendary castle 1,000 years after you were chased out, not by bringing an army to violently conquer it, but by quietly paying cash to fix the plumbing, polish the stone, and sweep the floors.
It's astonishingly humble and powerful at the same time. But I really have to wonder about the internal, emotional effect of this.
If they aren't doing it for PR or political clout, what is the psychological impact on the everyday believer, someone who flies from a modern, noisy apartment in Mumbai, walks through the chaotic dust of Cairo, and steps through those gates into that gleaming, perfectly restored, silent mosque?
The psychological impact is immeasurable because it profoundly validates their entire existence in history. We often vastly underestimate the power of physical space in religion.
The Bohra theology is intensely abstract. We've talked about hidden imams, esoteric inner meanings, complex spiritual hierarchies, cosmic lineages. That can feel very distant.
By restoring the mosques of Cairo, the leadership provides their modern followers with a tangible, physical, undeniable link to their thousand-year-old history.
They can run their hands along the walls their imams built. They can weep in the courtyards where their empire once thrived. It takes all those abstract, esoteric beliefs and transforms them into a physical reality that you can touch, smell, and see.
It proves to the believer that they are not just a displaced merchant community trying to survive. They are the true living inheritors of a magnificent empire.
It takes the hidden, the datin, and makes it incredibly visible. It is a brilliant, profoundly moving way to cement a community's identity across centuries.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's briefly look back at the immense, towering history we've just traveled through.
We started with a deeply philosophical, universe-altering theological dispute over a deceased son in the 8th century. We watched that sheer conviction build the magnificent Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, only to see it completely shatter over the brutal ambitions of a military dictator.
We followed a desperate splinter faction into the harsh mountains of Yemen, where a truly visionary queen hid their infant imam to save his divine lineage from extinction.
We tracked their terrifying migration across the ocean to India, where they disguised themselves as merchants, built an impenetrable fortress of wealth, and created a highly structured society bound by absolute secrecy and total communal support.
And finally, we saw them return, 1,000 years later, to quietly, devotedly restore the architectural glories of Cairo.
This history is the ultimate testament to the mechanics of resilience. It proves that a religious identity is rarely just a matter of reading sacred texts in a vacuum. It is brutally hammered into shape by famine, by political betrayal, by the harsh necessity of trade, and by the sheer, unyielding human will to survive against completely impossible odds.
It really makes you look differently at the world, doesn't it? It makes you genuinely wonder about the unseen communities moving through the streets of your own city. People quietly carrying ancient, hidden histories, esoteric truths, and secret allegiances right past you while you wait for your morning coffee.
There is a profound depth to the human experience that is almost always hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for anyone curious enough to stop and look.
And that brings me to a final thought I want to leave you, the listener, with today. Think about this. For centuries, the Bohras have survived, thrived, and built immense wealth entirely on the belief that the highest, most profound spiritual truths must be kept utterly secret in order to be preserved.
They believe that broadcasting the truth to those not ready for it diminishes it, corrupts it, or endangers it. Today, we live in a hypermodern age where the absolute opposite is true, where every thought, belief, and moment is broadcasted, tweeted, streamed, and overshared to the point of total exhaustion.
So, is it possible that the Bohras are right? In a modern world that violently demands we reveal everything about ourselves at all times, is there a unique, deeply lost power